Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are. This is Marshall McDonald talking with Bob Mover. Bob Mover is getting ready to open his online music academy, the Bob Mover Academy. And today we were going to talk about the great Lee Konitz, who was one of my favorite saxophone players going back to when maybe I was 18 years old. How you doing today, Bob?
I am fine, Marshall. And how are you, my friend?
I'm doing all right, I guess. The world's gone crazy, Bob.
The world's not crazy, but you can be in Japan and I can be in New York City and we can be talking.
How
So
about
with all
that?
the craziness, there's my grandmother always said, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. And we need lemonade. We need a lot of sugar in this world,
We need a lot of sugar.
or honey, or whatever's going to sweeten it, because the world is not very sweet these days, is it?
Maybe some artificial sweetener, too.
Artificial sweetener, I'm not sure if that's good for you. I don't like it. I think it causes your body to think that it's getting sugar. And I'm not into thinking, into fooling people.
Right. It's really not a healthy thing. I don't use artificial sugar actually.
Yeah, because I think it fools the body to thinking it's getting sugar. It goes, oh, give me that sugar. And then it says, no, wait a minute, you're not sugar.
So the first time I heard your playing was on a Lee Konitz Bob Mover recording. You were very young at the time, and then of course I began listening to some later sessions later. I really enjoyed your work on especially the sessions on Chet Baker, which we'll talk about on a later date. But I'd like to know just in the beginning, what were lessons like with Lee Konitz? How did you meet Lee Konitz? Were you a protege? Did you hang out with him a lot?
I only took one official lesson with Lee, and it
Hmm.
wasn't really much of an official lesson. How I met him was, you got to believe in karma in this world. And it's funny because one of the books that influenced me in my life, you and I have had talked about spiritual matters. A book that affected me profoundly is Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. And it was funny, one day I was walking down the street with Autobiography of a Yogi and Walter Davis Jr. I ran into Walter in the middle of the street. This was in the 70s when I first started to read the book. I was about 22, 23. And well, I actually had read it earlier, but I was reading it. Walter said, oh, Autobiography of a Yogi. Man, Bird turned me on to that book. So it was interesting that Bird was also kind of into it. And aside from any joining any organization or this type of thing, what Yogananda was talking about was this really bringing home the idea of karma. He talks in about how if you believe in something very strongly and you put the idea in the world enough, it will manifest itself. And this doesn't happen consistently. If it happened consistently to me, then I probably would be well far more exalted than I am. And but there are occasions in one's life where you go, you know what? I think there's something to this. So the way I met Lee Konitz, I believe, is an interesting example of how this happens in a universal sense, but in particular in my life. I was in Miami, where was just one of the places I was raised. I was 17 years old, almost 18. As a matter of fact, I just turned 18. It was in March. And the Easter vacation was coming at the University of Miami. When I was 17, I was a featured soloist with the University of Miami band under Jerry Coker, jazz band. Coker heard me at a session with Ira Sullivan and said, come on, you're going to play in the university band. And he really encouraged me. So I was hanging out at the university a lot. I actually stopped going to high school at that point and just hung out at the university. So I was around there, and I was playing in the band and teaching the students there for $3 a lesson. I remember my first students. That was my first teaching experience.
Excuse
Anyway,
me, Bob. Excuse me, Bob. What year was that for us?
that was 1969.
Oh,
That was 1969.
this was almost the beginning of jazz education in the schools with Jerry Cooker and David Baker and all those guys,
This was
wasn't
one of the first university bands. They had been in Indiana, and I think maybe North Texas State or somewhere else were the first ones to have jazz departments.
it? Hmm.
And David Baker and Coker had started that in Indiana. And Jerry Coker moved to Florida to start the University of Miami Jazz Department,
Hmm.
which was only a year or two old at the time. And he brought with him Whit Seidner, who later became the head of the department, Gary Campbell, who we know is a wonderful saxophone player and a brilliant guy, and also a guy named Jerry Green. who was Marshall. You would have loved Jerry Green. Jerry Green was a hell of an alto player.
Huh.
He was a terrific player. Unfortunately, Jerry, I hope he's still alive, but he had a lot of mental problems. I guess you might call him what's now known as bipolar, and it got the best of him.
Hmm.
So unfortunately, but there is a book called Patterns for Jazz, which Coker wrote along with Jerry Green, Jimmy Casals, who was a wonderful saxophone player who died young, and Gary Campbell. Those are the four names in that Patterns for Jazz, which was the
Okay. But,
first book after Oliver Nelson.
we all had that book. I had that book, and I practiced religiously with it at University of Pittsburgh. But I never knew who Jerry Green was. The other guys I knew, I never knew who Jerry Green was.
Yeah, we used to call him Bean, not because of Coleman Hawkins, but we called him, Green Bean.
Right.
And Jerry was well. That's another topic, And in my, I'm writing my memoirs. In there, I kind of do a little bit about Jerry. He came to New York for a short time, actually, in the '70s, and used to come and sit in with Tom Harrell and I. And he was playing tenor at that time. But he went back to. He was originally from Georgia,
Hmm.
and he went back to Georgia. But anyway, so I was playing with a drummer named Jimmy Chapek in Miami, who was working with Ira Sullivan, and we would get together and play duets for hours. And like I said, I think I just turned 18. And Jimmy, I'd heard Lee Konitz with some of Tristano records that my friend Brooks Kerr, a wonderful piano player who lived in New York, and I'd known from before, had played for me. And I liked the Tristano music, but it wasn't quite what I was into at the time. I was into Horace Silver. I was into Bird, and I was into that type of stuff, and I was into Sonny Rollins, and I couldn't quite make the. I think the time feeling of Tristano music didn't really get me. I got it later. I liked it better, but Jimmy said, "Are you hip to this guy?" And he put on a record called Motion Lee, which is the trio record that Lee played with Sonny Dallas on bass and Elvin Jones on drums. And when I heard ba 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 boo boo bit booey be da ba be da 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 da, as soon as I heard that, I was enthralled. I said, "Wait a minute, what's this?" It was one of those really epiphanal moments. I said, "Wait, who's this cat?" The invention of it, the pure improvisation that I heard going on, I just really started to get into Sonny Rollins seriously, and of course I was in love with Bird and still am, and there's no question about that. But aside from that, I'd never heard somebody taking so many chances. Like I loved Phil Woods and I loved Sonny Stitt, I loved Jackie McLean, and Jackie took chances. He did too, but the kind of really going out on a limb, like the kind of way that Sonny was really the only guy I heard that took those kind of chances to me, and he was making it. He was really putting his life on the line with every phrase, and yet it was beautiful. The way things hooked up, the sensibility. Plus, I liked the liner notes that he wrote on the record, where he said that he was kind of happy about not having really made it professionally, but he said it gave him a chance to relax and get some insight into his life. And later on in life, I would really kind of understand that, because I never really made it professionally in the sense of the way a lot of people did. But yet, I think it may have helped me in the end. It's weird how that goes. But anyway, I was excited by the liner notes that he wrote and everything about it. And I said, I got to meet this guy, Lee Konitz. Now, I happen to know, because I had lived in New York the year before, and I had to move because of some family problems and this and that, but I'd gone back in the summer of '69. And I'd been in New York and hung out and lived there. I spent a lot of time with Evelyn Blakey and Wynton Kelly and Kenny Dorham. We're often at her house, and that's a different story. But Brooks Kerr, my close friend, was quite wealthy at the time. His family did actually lose their money in the end, but he had this beautiful townhouse. So I was often at Brooks's house, and he had the best record collection in the world. Plus, the Ellington Band was always hanging out at Brooks's house. He was the world's foremost authority. Even Stanley Dance admitted that Brooks probably knew more than he did. Duke said, if you want to know something about my band, ask Brooks Kerr. He's our encyclopedia.
So how'd you meet Lee Konitz, though?
This is what's kind of happening. Yeah. So it's coming up. So now the I heard this record, and I saw the reason I knew Lee was in New York was because I lived in New York. I bought the Village Voice every week. And in the back of the Village Voice, there was an instruction section. So it said, instruction. It said Lee Konitz. And I knew that he was teaching in New York. In fact, I'll never forget his ad because it said Lee Konitz, now teaching, accepting students, all instruments, all levels, advanced, intermediate, beginner, and tone deaf. That was what his ad said. So,
Because
so I said
he wasn't working a lot then, if I remember.
he was not working a lot. No, he had been he was scuffling. Yeah, he was really not doing too well. And so I said, you know, I've got to meet this guy. Now it happened to be that I just happened to have the money to get to New York and have a few dollars in my pocket. My grandmother had given me a birthday present, so I had about $20 to spend, and I had a few dollars from the $3 lessons I was giving. And there was a ride, round trip, going from the university. I looked on the bulletin board, ride to New York in a van, 6 people, $15 round trip, everybody. We're going to stay for 8 days in New York. So I called and I said, I got to take this ride up to New York. So he said, okay, we're leaving in 3 hours. Can you make it? So, you know, I grabbed a change of underwear basically and just my horn and took off. And so when we got to around Washington, D.C., it occurred to me that I had forgotten to tell Brooks that I was coming in because I was going to stay at Brooks's house and he didn't even know I was on my way. So I said, oh, it would behoove me to call. There were no cell phones in those days, of course, for those of us who wouldn't know that. So we got to DC and I got to a payphone and I took my quarters and put them all in and called Brooks and said, hey, Brooks. Now, Brooks was blind. So that's an important part of the story as well. Brooks had very, very little vision, tiny vision like Art Tatum. He later lost his sight entirely, but at this point he had tiny vision. And I said, Brooks, I'm coming to New York. And he said, sure. Oh, I said, can I stay with you? He said, of course. He said, but may I ask you why the sudden, sudden impulse to move to come to New York for these days? I told him about Lee Konitz. I said, I got to meet Lee Konitz. I heard this record. I'm crazy about it. I got to meet this cat. It's like, and I read his teaching. So I'm going to call him when I get in and ask him for a lesson. And, I don't know what he charges. And Brooks says, don't worry. If you don't have it, I'll give you the rest of it, because Brooks was that kind of guy. So I said, great. Brooks said, listen, when you get here, though, I may not be here. I'm going to leave the key in a special place. He told me where he's going to leave the key. But I'm going out to the half note to hear Roy Eldridge. So I said, oh, all right. Well, he said, look, let yourself in, where the liquor cabinet is and blah, 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 and make yourself a drink. And I'll be home about 2 a.m. or something like that. I'm going to catch the music down to the half note. So I said, cool. Okay. So I got there about 1 a.m, got into New York, got into Brooks's apartment. I'm laying back with the scotch in Brooks's living room, listening to some Coleman Hawkins. And Brooks opens the door and he's got the head. He looks like the cat that ate the canary. And he says, Bob, you're not going to believe what happened tonight. I said, what happened? He said, well, I sat at the bar at the half note. I was listening to Roy. And between sets, I struck up a conversation with the guy next to me at the bar. And he was very erudite. He knew a lot about Roy. In fact, he knew a lot about the music. I mean, this guy really knew. So we had a lovely conversation for about, 20 minutes. And I asked him finally, I said, you really seem to know about this music. What's your name? He said, oh, I'm Lee Konitz. It was Lee Konitz. He said, here's an address. He says, come to this address in the Village tomorrow at 4 o'clock. You'll be his last student of the day at Dick Katz's studio. So I had Lee Konitz's address from Brooks going to the club that night, to the bar, the half note. Next.
I'm sorry. There you go. So you said you only took one lesson with Lee, or you hung out with Lee?
That was
how much did you learn from Lee? How did you learn it? How did you reach the point where he wanted to record? He said, okay, I'll record a record with you.
By the old-fashioned way of apprenticeship. Lee said to me, I took one lesson. I took this lesson, and it was a beautiful lesson. Lee said, play something. So I played Lush Life for him. He said, that's beautiful. Now play something with some rhythm. So I played I'll Remember April. and I played it in G. He said, that's nice. He said, can you play it in D flat? So I played it in D flat. Then he said, can you play it in E? Then I played it in E. And he said, can you play it this tempo? I played it there. He said, can you play it ooh, doo, dee, dee? Can you play it as a waltz? So I spent an hour playing I Remember April. And then he took his horn out and we played duets on I Remember April. So there I was blowing with him and in different keys on I Remember April and everything. Then he shifted keys without telling me where he was going. And this was my first lesson, I'm there and we do that. And then at the end of the lesson, Dick Katz walks in and Lee says, hey, now you can play it with a piano player. So Dick Katz sat down and we played it together. And not to blow my old horn, Lee said, I've never had a lesson like this. He said, you're the most brilliant student I've ever had. I said, wow. He said, you really have worked very hard at this music. He said, you're really serious about this. I said, it's my whole life, of course. He said, and I said, I told him the story of how I got there and everything. I said, it's weird that I told him all about Miami and the ride and then Brooks meeting him. And so he said, that's fantastic. And he said, I said, I've got to pay you something. I said, how much do you charge? And Lee said, I charge, I think it was $25. And I said, Lee, I have like $17. And Brooks, I have like $15 or something like that. And Lee said, yeah, you know what? 15 is cool. Don't worry about it. He said, I'm so broke right now. It doesn't matter. And I remember we talked about things and I said, Lee, one of the things I really respect about you is that you don't play on the Merv Griffin show or the Tonight Show, and you could, but I studied Richie Kamuka. I'd already lived in New York and studied with Richie and Al Cohn, and I'd had some experience. I played with Roy Eldridge by that time too. I was only 18, but I'd had at Zoot. I knew all those guys, and I played with them when I was 16. So it wasn't, my first experience playing with a great player, and I played with Ira Sullivan since I was 16, 15. So, but Lee said, well, I said, you don't do that. You just play jazz. I said, and I just respect that so much. And Lee said, I hate to burst your bubble, my man. But, if the Merv Griffin show called me tomorrow, I would have my clarinet out and I'd be learning some flute and I would do it. He said, because, this jazz life is starting to get to me. He says, I can't get the gigs,
Right.
And very difficult. And he started telling me how difficult it was and how much you have to sacrifice to do this. And we talked about that. Anyway, and then he said, listen, I got a new record out. And it was the Lee Konitz duet record on it was that Milestone Records, I think. And the Cats had produced it, I think. And he gave me the record even. I paid him the $15 for the lesson. He gave me a free record to take with me.
So how old were you then when you met Lee Konitz?
18.
You were 18?
I had turned 18 the week before.
And when did someone tell you to start learning tunes in different keys and to do stuff in 12 keys, stuff like that?
I just knew to do that.
Well, how did you know? You must have been, but you must have been playing with some musicians that were more advanced with you that could help you, guide you into what you're going to do, right? Was it Ira Sullivan?
Ira Sullivan and Joe DiOrio, the great guitarist, were in Florida, and they had the steady gig for years at a place called the Rancher Lounge, 5 nights a week. Mm-hmm. And I would sit in with them. I would wait till the owner went home, and then they'd sneak me into the club, and they'd often let me play the last set with them. So they would do that. They would call, all of a sudden you'd be, they played Con Alma on me one night, man. And I'd never played Con Alma. And boy, did I step all over myself. I was trying to find where it started. Right. I knew it was sort of like confirmation. I could hear that the first change, or there will never be another you, that went into the relative minor. And then it resolved to a key that seemed like a major third away. I wasn't sure. But, Ira told me, another guy who didn't technically know music, that tunes went to different keys. So you got to know there's a tonic and the tunes move around. So I knew that much. And I studied with Phil Woods for the summer in New Hope, Pennsylvania, at this camp, Ramblerny, where Roger Rosenberg went and Michael Brecker went. And, it was some fast company in that place, Richie Cole.
I've seen pictures of that, pictures of them all there. And I know about Gary Campbell. He was involved with the Loft sessions in New York. Gene Perla has some of the recordings online now. Gary was very influential, actually, to Michael Brecker, along with
Well, they used to have those with
Mark Copeland.
Liebman and Grossman. And Gary was in New York in that summer. He was in the summer of 67, 69.
Right. He
Gary was
recorded
working
at
with,
at Gene Peerless Loft a little bit during that summer. Gene has them posted on an educational website now.
yeah, Perla had a loft and Liebman had a loft that Mike Brecker later took over.
Uh,
And there were a few different lofts. There were also after-hour sessions at the top of the gate, the village gate. And these guys were playing mostly free. And then there was the band Dreams that was starting to rehearse. And Sanborn was in that. That was where he was first in that. And a couple of times I subbed, and I hated it. I had the worst time in that band. It was so loud that I like
right.
it was much too much for me. But anyway, that was. I mean, I loved the musicianship. Everybody was great,
Yeah,
but the
that
volume.
post Coltrane thing. Grossman was probably the top of the pack. I think he was the most advanced player out of the whole crowd at the youngest age. I've heard from
Well,
many
and
players in New York.
well, I knew Steve when he played alto and sounded like Phil Woods
Yeah,
when he was 17.
yeah.
We were that's
But
another
but,
story.
but
We knew.
I think he got the gig with Miles at 18 on soprano. He definitely had adopted some Coltrane somewhere along the line.
Well, he had a lot of Coltrane. No, he did. He did do that. When he switched to tenor, that's when he played like Train. But who was the most advanced, I thought, in some ways, or who played the best middle period Train of everybody was Bob Berg.
It was a
Uh,
little later though. Lehman and Grossman were from the tapes, and even as Lehman said, were
yeah, Lehman
kind of
Gross.
ahead of everyone else at the time.
Yeah, Bob Berg came on a little bit more like the early 70s. Yeah, Bob
Because
was more.
Lehman's the oldest, I think, right?
Lehman was the oldest,
Yeah.
and then there was Steve Grossman and Brecker, and Gary Campbell was around, and I was around with some of those sessions.
Right.
I would play um, when they did the free stuff and that kind of stuff. I didn't do that much of that, but Brecker and I were like freaking frack. We went to a lot of places together,
Right.
and you know that was so we made a lot of those sessions. I made some of those.
So
You know,
Lee, more so than you being a student of Lee, he became a major influence for your playing. And before that, you must have started saxophone somewhere around the age of 10 or 9 or something like that.
no, I was 13.
13.
Yeah, but I practiced a lot.
Did you have a teacher, or how did that work for you?
Oh, well, I did. Let me just one thing about Lee though. The other thing about the thing of being influenced by Lee is after that, when I left New York and I came back a few years later, but we wrote letters to each other. He wrote me letters and I wrote him letters. We had a correspondence, and I would ask him questions about music and that kind of thing. I had certain things about, and he was not specific about changes. He wouldn't talk to me about harmony so much. He said you got to learn to just play melodically. He was very much about that. And then he said we'll send you to Lenny at some point. But he started to let me sit in with him more. Like when he would play at the half note, he'd let me play like the whole last set with him. Another person who would do that. So I learned by on the bandstand with him, and I go to his house and we'd play duets, and we'd take walks in Central Park with his dog Jingo Weinhard was the name of his dog, and so we became friends, and I mean, I considered it studying with him. So I I moved to Boston when I was 18. Well, I spent the summer when I was 18 in New York and went over to his house 4 or 5 times a week. And then I met Jackie Byard, and he said I should come to Boston and play with him. And I went to his class at New England Conservatory. He considered me a teaching assistant because I wasn't an official student, but that's another story. But as you were saying, uh, when I started to play, I had already been able to sing all these Charlie Parker solos and Lester Young and Stan Getz. Those were 3 of the solos I hadn't, and I could sing Miles Davis's whole Round About Midnight record, including Coltrane solos. I could sing everybody's solos. I could sing Bud Powell, the amazing Bud Powell, the record from beginning to end. I spent all day singing, and I didn't know. And I started to sing songs. I could sing standards, and I would sing for the neighbors. And then my voice changed. When I was about 12, I started to sing like Alfalfa, I'm in the mood for love.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden, I said, well, I want to play an instrument. And so the saxophone was the closest thing to the human voice to me. And my dad was a trumpet player, and I didn't want to compete with him. And I tried to teach. He was a very bad teacher, my dad. So I played a little trumpet, and I didn't want to go near that anymore. But the saxophone seemed like an interesting thing to do. And so that was what I did. And for the day I got it, I practiced 8 to sometimes 12 hours a day. And I was rarely in school, or if I was in school, I made friends with the band teacher who like would just let me play in the band room, or it was in Miami. I'd go out on the football field
Right.
and play while they had, I wouldn't go to classes.
So that's basically the key I was looking for, because no one becomes a great player with a lot of practice and a lot of usually some good guides to guide us. And I want to wrap up this moment about this moment about Lee Konitz. It's clear that you spending all that time with him, although it wasn't formal lessons, you were basically becoming like Jackie McLean was to Charlie Parker. Just the fact of being with the man and absorbing the music and playing with the person is taking lessons with someone, basically.
Oh yeah,
This
and
is
the same with Ira Sullivan.
in fact, it's
I,
probably better than taking lessons with someone, because now you've become how do you say, almost like a Zen. You're a small Zen part of the whole being of Lee Konitz, and that's really what developed your playing.
that's the
You know.
key to it, that Zen thing, because it's really, I mean, people throw that term around, but with Ira Sullivan, Ira taught me what it was to be mentored. Because I met Ira when I was 13, he was 34. And tell me, how many 34-year-old guys are going to hang out after the gig talking about music, life, and everything under the sun? Jesus Christ, the Bible. I mean,
Right.
not just that, but I mean, Eastern philosophy, Henry Miller, I mean, and Charlie Parker,
Yeah, that's
and all these, Clifford Brown,
that's
and
what
hang until the
those
sun
great those
came up.
that's what those great jazz hangs were about. I'm gonna wrap up this moment, which it seemed to be maybe a 30-minute moment. So
It was a bit of a moment. I'm sorry I carried on.
we're gonna
But that was
and
how I met Lee. I thought it was an interesting idea, I mean,
all right.
and that that covers that. But I never can. I know someday we'll talk about Ira, but
All
I
right.
don't. They both died last year, and I'm still feeling it.
Well, I think we should talk about that in more depth. Let me wrap this one up, and we're going to have another session later on, I think, about Chet Baker. But until then, it's been a moment with Bob Mover talking about the great Lee Konitz, and the Lee Konitz record with Elvin Jones was one of the first ones that I went and bought too. I also had a friend who was very much into the Lenny Tristano school in the high school I went to. So he was
Wow.
Andy Feit, who now lives in Sweden. He was deeply into it, so he had every single record, and I was his roommate once. So so and I
You
got
got an osmosis.
I really enjoyed to tell you the truth, a lot of black players had an antithesis about that whole school, but I found it quite fascinating, and I understand at the time they did. I know that Charlie Parker loved Lee Konitz, and I used to tell people that he played with Lenny, he enjoyed, because there was a moment in time when music. Remember when jazz music became a certain race division? Remember that time?
Yeah. I
And
remember
I
it
think
happened more in my lifetime. I think if you could say more, but when Martin Luther King was killed,
mhm,
there was a definite feeling among a lot of black people that white guys shouldn't be playing this. Go play your own music. Go play
right,
your Beethoven, your Bach,
right.
and this and that. Which brings me to another story, which I think you might, in this context, I want to tell it to you. We can use it some other time or whatever.
Well, give,
But
give
this
me
is
a second. Let me close up this moment, and we're going to pause for just a little bit of time and go get some juice and some drink. And we'll see you in the next minute. This is Marshall McDonald. I'll see you on the next time with Bob. Good morning, Vietnam. No, I'm kidding. Good morning, everybody. Today we're with Bob Mover, who's opening his online music academy shortly, and I'm proud to say he's asked me to be a member of the faculty there. It looks like a really good thing is coming with this. Take two. I don't like that. Give me 1 second.